Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. We are taking on a true masterpiece of situational irony today, Shirley Jackson's chilling 1948 short story, The Lottery. But we aren't just going to look at it as a standard piece of literature. We're going to treat it as a clinical sociolinguistic case study, examining exactly how language and behavior intertwine to commit an annual atrocity. To do this, we'll be using 4 distinct theories of aggression from social psychology to deconstruct how an otherwise completely ordinary town orchestrates this event. Here is the cognitive roadmap for our analysis. We're going to systematically examine the text through 4 analytical lenses: frustration-aggression theory, social learning and tradition, displaced aggression and scapegoating, and finally, de-individuation in the crowd. Once we've unpacked those, we'll synthesize them into what we can call the architecture of violence. Jackson opens the story with this incredibly idyllic scene. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. I mean, just look at those specific lexical choices: fresh warmth, blossoming profusely. This semantic field of vitality completely masks the violence to come. It sets up this brilliant deceptive normalcy. It suggests a tight-knit rural community where a horrifying civic ritual is just seamlessly woven into the ordinary rhythms of daily life.
Which brings us to the central cognitive dissonance of the text. Seriously, how does a pastoral summer morning descend into sanctioned communal murder before noon? How do neighbors, friends, and family members casually gossip with each other one minute and then literally pick up stones to kill one of their own the next? Think of this entire explainer as a psychological autopsy of that ritual. Let's deconstruct the mechanics behind it.
Section 1, Frustration-Aggression Theory. We will focus on the mechanics of blocked goals and collective social anxiety. Back in 1939, Dollard and his colleagues proposed frustration-aggression theory, establishing a very direct causal chain. The premise is that when goal-directed behavior is blocked, an aggressive impulse is born. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway: that aggression doesn't necessarily have to be aimed directly at the thing causing the frustration. If the real source of the anxiety is diffuse or inaccessible, say a fear of crop failure or communal instability, that aggressive impulse still exists. It just seeks out a substitute target.
And this brilliantly illustrates the evolution of psychological thought. On the left, we have Sigmund Freud's early concept of thanatos, or the death instinct, the idea that aggression is this innate, unavoidable human drive, deeply embedded in our minds, constantly seeking destruction. But on the right, Dollard's theory reframes aggression. It's not an inevitable natural drive. It's a specific, reactive impulse. It's triggered when our expectations are blocked. In the story, the villagers harbor this diffuse social anxiety, and the lottery acts as an institutionalized pressure valve to channel that exact frustration.
We actually see this residual frustration erupt in Tessie Hutchinson's final moments. She screams, "It isn't fair, it isn't right," and then they are upon her. Pay close attention to her specific phrasing. She relies entirely on the language of procedural equity, fair, and right. Her frustration is communicated through civic terms, not moral ones. She only protests when her own family slip is drawn, and she complains that her husband wasn't given enough time to choose his paper. Her goal of survival is abruptly blocked, triggering a desperate, albeit futile, aggressive protest, just as the crowd's own pent-up frustration is violently released onto her.
Moving on to Section 2, Social Learning and Tradition. We are shifting our focus from individual frustration to the cultural, intergenerational transmission of violence.
In the 1960s, Albert Bandura introduced social learning theory. You're probably familiar with his famous Bobo doll experiment. He proposed that aggression is simply a learned behavior. It is acquired through observational learning, watching others and imitating them, rather than through direct experience or explicit sit-down instruction. In Bandura's experiment, children who watched adults act aggressively toward a doll were far more likely to mirror that exact aggressive behavior themselves.
Jackson maps this process perfectly onto the villagers' behavior in 3 distinct steps. Step 1 is adult modeling. We have figures like Old Man Warner, who is participating in his 77th lottery, acting as a steadfast, authoritative role model. Step 2 is child observation. The children watch this extreme violence being treated as an expected, routine, highly normalized civic duty. And step 3 is imitation. The children reproduce the behavior. Think back to the foreshadowing early in the story. The children are the very first ones to gather the smoothest, roundest stones. They inherited the ritual without anyone needing to explicitly teach it to them. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer horror packed into this single sentence. And someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Davy is Tessie's youngest son.
This is arguably the absolute darkest, most disturbing enactment of Bandura's principle in the entire text. The model of violence is so thoroughly normalized and culturally internalized that it gets transmitted right within the victim's own family. Davy is handed stones to kill his own mother, and because he is simply imitating the adults around him, he takes them.
Let's transition to Section 3, Displaced Aggression and Scapegoating, examining how individual aggression scales up to target a specific outgroup.
Scapegoating is essentially displacement functioning at a societal level. Collective frustration desperately seeks an outlet, but the real cause is untouchable or completely unknown. So what happens? The community directs its aggression at a weaker, identifiable substitute target. The psychological function of the victim in this institutional ritual isn't about being guilty of a crime. Their function is purely to act as a sponge to absorb the collective aggression of the community.
Old Man Warner actually articulates the ancient, irrational logic behind this institutionalized scapegoating with a rhythmic folk saying, "Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon." Notice the archaic zero copula there, corn be heavy, and the tight rhyming structure. It's designed to be a memorable, unquestionable linguistic artifact that justifies the scapegoating. The original ritual was clearly tied to ancient agricultural beliefs, right? Exchanging a randomly chosen victim's death for a bountiful harvest. And while the original black box is lost and much of the ritual has been discarded, this core linguistic and psychological scapegoating mechanism persists. The victim is chosen by a random slip of paper, which means their personal guilt is utterly irrelevant. They are nothing but a pure substitute target for communal anxiety.
On to Section 4, De-individuation in the crowd and the dissolution of moral inhibition.
Philip Zimbardo highlighted the concept of de-individuation in 1969, and it explains a terrifying shift in human behavior. When people are immersed in a crowd, they experience anonymity. This group immersion drastically reduces individual self-awareness and severely weakens internal moral inhibitions. It diffuses responsibility across the crowd, suppressing individual rational agency and triggering major disinhibition, allowing people to commit severe norm-violating behavior.
So the crucial point is that the structure of the lottery engineers this exact dissolution of moral agency. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. Notice that no single villager condemns Tessie. The black box does. The ritual diffuses responsibility so widely across all 300 townspeople that no individual feels fully culpable. This crowd mentality suppresses their rational agency. Take Mrs. Delacroix, for example. She was warmly chatting with Tessie just moments before, but she abruptly rolls switches into a stone thrower because the situational forces of the crowd completely override her personal moral character.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our final section, synthesizing the sociolinguistic framework to map the architecture of violence.
If we walk through this matrix, it perfectly synthesizes how these four layers operate simultaneously to construct a totally unescapable system. At the base, individual motivation is driven by frustration, aggression. Diffuse social anxieties are demanding a sanctioned outlet. Above that, cultural transmission is maintained by social learning. The ritual persists because it is inherited through generational observation. Then, target selection is handled through scapegoating. The community requires a substitute recipient for their aggression. And finally, the actual execution is made possible by collective action through de-individuation. The group structure dissolves individual moral agency so that ordinary decent people can commit an atrocity without conscious guilt.
We've seen how seamlessly a society can construct a framework of normalized violence, hiding it right behind the deceptive normalcy of a sunny summer morning and a neatly organized civic event. The story actually mentions that other villages have already abandoned the lottery. So as linguistics and psychology students, I leave you with this provocative thought. If violence is learned, modeled, displaced, and so heavily dependent on crowd conformity and the language we use to justify it, what would it actually take for a society to unlearn a deeply entrenched violent ritual? What is the mechanism that breaks this architecture down? Think about that. Thank you for exploring this with me today.